Hey, my name is Josh Korak. I'm a mental health counselor in the Northern Colorado area. In this space, I get the chance to interview professionals in the field, talk about mental illness, self-care, and so much more. With this show, I ask you to join me in doing what one of my favorite philosophers, a Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, says. Smile, breathe, and go slowly. This is Care with Korak. Hey everyone, welcome back to Care with Korak. I'm really glad you're here. Hope everyone's having a great week. Today we are joined by a very unique guest, a little bit different from some of the mental health professionals and guests I have on my podcast. This time I'm joined by Dr. Joseph E. Davis. Dr. Davis is a research professor of sociology and director of the Picturing the Human Project of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Professor Davis's research explores the intersecting questions of self, morality, and cultural change. In studies of medicine, psychiatry, work, AI, aging, social movements, and other fields, he has examined trauma psychology, narratives of suffering, the rise of biological explanations of mental life, medicalization, psychoactive drug use, and our cultural dreams of technological mastery. Whew. Good stuff. He is the author or editor of several books, including most recently, Chemically Imbalanced, Everyday Suffering, Medication, and Our Troubled Quest for Self-Mastery, which came out in 2020. The Evening of Life, The Challenges of Aging and Dying Well, which also came out in 2020. And To Fix or to Heal, Patient Care, Public Health, and the Limits of Biomedicine. His articles have appeared in many journals, peer-reviewed and popular. He is a former editor of the Hedgehog Review and writes a Psychology Today blog called Our New Discontents, Reflections on Mental Health and the Social Ideals. Currently, he is at work co-editing a special issue of Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry on, quote, being human in the age of the brain, models of mind, and their social effects, end quote, as well as two book projects, The Troubles of Youth and an essay on human misunderstanding. In this episode, Dr. Davis and I discuss the role of medications in mental health from a sociological context, whether groupings such as diagnoses limit us or help us as a society, and how mental health treatment has evolved over the years in the way that we understand it, and so much more. For more information on Dr. Davis, check out his profile in the link in the bio. Make sure to check out his most recent book, Chemically Imbalanced. Follow me at Josh Korak on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube for video clips, podcast previews, and more mental health content. If you are in a mental health crisis, please call 988 or go to your nearest emergency room. If you are from Colorado and are interested in scheduling a session with me, please reach out at sojourncounselingco.com/Josh. That's my website, or email me, josh@sojourncounselingco.com. All right, I think that just about does it. Let's not waste any more time and get into it. This is Care with Korak with Dr. Joseph Davis. All right, hey, Dr. Davis, welcome to Care with Korak.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Hey, well, I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day and your busy schedule to take some time to talk with me and my audience and share a little bit about all the stuff that you've been working on. It's been super fascinating reading up on some of the work you've been doing. Could you just share a little bit about who you are, what you do, some of the research you've been going at for the past couple of years now?
Yeah, certainly. So just professionally, I'm a research professor of sociology here at the University of Virginia, as well as director of something called the Picturing the Human Working Group at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, which is a part of UVA. So as a research professor, I do a lot of research, and rather than much teaching, although I direct seminars here at our institute. But those are primarily for graduate students and postdocs
Mm.
and visiting professors. So they're not really for undergraduates. I used to teach more, but now I do teach an annual course in the January term called Prozac culture. That
Interesting.
might be worth talking about.
Yeah.
Picturing the human, which is really kind of what all my research is about, is sort of understandings of human persons and how those are changing and how those are being rethought in various institutions in practices. And so our working group, we've done a series of conferences. Uh, we did a book that published in 2020 called The Evening of Life, The Challenges of Aging and Dying Well,
Mm.
which was about the aging process. We just, a new issue of the journal Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, um, which published the papers from our conference in 20, okay, I'm losing track of my years, in 2020, right before the pandemic actually started. And that was called Being Human in the Age of the Brain. And that was mostly focused on questions about kind of the image of the person or the picture of the person in neuroscience, and so on. So we've done related projects on AI and various other kinds of things. Um, and really all my research now for 25 years has been really concerned with the human person in work,
Mm.
in psychiatry, in school, in the family, and so on.
Yeah.
So ways in which we understand who we are and what we're made of, so to speak, and then kind of how that's refracted through different institutions. Um, the sociological, I'm not a sociology doesn't really have a concept of the person, I would say. Um,
Hmm.
so the discipline, it tends to view everybody as more or less kind of socially determined. You don't really study persons, you study environments.
Right.
It's like an environmental view, not environmental, but a kind of evolutionary view, right? It's
Mm.
environments that change, and then the species within the environment then change because the environment
Right.
changes, and you don't study the species, you study the environment. The
Mm.
sociology is kind of like that. So it's a kind of odd area to be in sociology. So a lot of my thinking about persons and so on comes from philosophy, not from sociology. But sociology could, because you get a real sense for context, history and context. That right, how we think about ourselves is not something we just make up individually, but it
Mm.
comes to us from a collective process. And so that's really what I study, and again in different institutions and so on. And
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I
so
mean,
yeah,
just coming at it from a more philosophical standpoint. I mean, you know, that I feel like to a certain extent that's inherent with fields like sociology, psychology, even more medical related fields, I'm sure. But you're right. I mean, with sociology, it tends to be more of focusing on the environment, people within their environment. So it's interesting that you come at it from more of a philosophical approach of what's going on, right?
right,
Um,
right.
Asking a lot of
And,
those
and
why questions.
and try to appreciate the fact that persons are free, right? So we're not
Mm,
we're there are a lot of social patterns, but we're not ultimately determined. And
right.
the sociological doesn't give a lot of room for human agency. It kind of says it does, but then
Mm,
in practice, all explanation is more or less what were the social factors,
yeah.
and that seems to me a kind of mistake and a philosophical mistake. And so, trying to kind of bring human freedom back into the picture means
Mm,
attending to persons and attending the way that they resist, as well as accommodate various kinds of social change and so on.
yeah.
It's not the case that everybody just does things, right. They do resist, and I take some hope in that, because it seems to be
Mm,
like a lot of the trends that I see I think are bad.
yeah.
So I'm
Well,
hoping that people can resist them.
right. Well, it kind of speaks to things such as, addiction or trauma, right? Where we're not determined by the past, you know, experiences that maybe our parents have had, or we think of things like there's a lot of clients I'll meet with who are really afraid of becoming alcoholics because maybe their dad was an alcoholic. And sure, there may be that genetic predisposition, but like what I'm hearing you say, at least, it sounds like, we are not determined to follow in that same path. We don't have to have that same social pattern.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly.
Mm,
Exactly. And anyway, and I think that's important always to, to,
yeah.
to affirm. And when I'm doing research, a lot of my research has been started with ordinary people. I'm working on a project now I'm calling The Troubles of Youth, and it begins with interviews with young people and how they understand their own circumstances, their own distress, and
Mm,
so on, rather than something top down that their problems reflect something else or something from above. Like how do they themselves understand their experience and so on,
right.
and so it's so kind of starting with persons and then thinking about the larger rather than
Mm,
in some sense the other way around.
yeah.
Seeing people always always being shaped by something else, something over them, above them, their parents, whatever the case might be.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It kind of makes me make that connection to, I was reading a couple of your articles, like I had mentioned before, and I think it was the one about you're writing a lot about some of the statistics out there around adolescence and mental health, and I think you're reporting somewhere between like 10 to 20% of teens in 2019 were diagnosed with depression, anxiety, were struggling with suicidal ideation, and things like that. And if I remember correctly, if I was reading the article right, you were almost expressing some frustration of like, okay, we have all these statistics now. Like the statistics are there, but what are we doing with that, right? We're forgetting the individual experiences that can come with that. And I'm hearing some of that in what you were just saying.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Uh, I fear, and again, that and again, this is, I'm not a mental health professional, so I'm somewhat unsympathetic to features of it, including the desire to kind of label people
Mm,
and put them into categories. And I understand why you might do that. So I'm not anti-diagnosis or
sure.
anything like that. But from a sociological point of view, um, you know, these groupings don't strike me as very helpful for understanding. If you understand what's going on with people, and certainly, I'm guessing a lot of your podcast listeners are therapists. Um,
Well, actually, it's kind of a mix. I mean, there
okay,
may be some, but it's actually more targeted towards the general
okay, yeah,
population. So,
right, right. But I think you know, in a more therapeutic or more dialogic, or you're just dealing with your friends,
mm,
which I think is actually the ideal way to deal with what I call everyday suffering is actually with your
mm,
friends, right? And
yeah,
engaging them and helping you understand a problem, situate it, and so on. Is that what you really want is someone to listen to your experience,
mm,
right? Not some category, right? And as soon as we put stuff in categories, it seems to me it almost automatically begins to kind of blind you to their experience, right? You
mm,
kind of stop listening. So I have a son that, again, we don't wander into these things accidentally. Um,
right,
though I began all this long before, but I have a son, my oldest son, who has a kind of autism spectrum thing.
mm,
Um, I don't even quite really know what that means in the sense that it seems to me some of the things that we associate with autism he displays and other things he's almost the opposite of. So it's a little
interesting.
unclear what that kind of category, but
Hmm.
for purposes of special ed and so on, you need categories, and he has that. But one of the things that I've seen other people is you put the category on, and then you begin to relate to them through the lens of the category, um, and right, and to kind of lose sight of who they are and what they might be good at and do,
Mm,
and it doesn't mean you have to lose sight of their limitations, but at the same time, like who are they and what how are they interacting in the world, what kind of capabilities they have, with all that kind of stuff. Uh, and so again, these kind of labels. One is depressed. I mean, the students I had interviewed often almost seek refuge in these diagnostic
Mm-hmm.
categories in a way that one of the criticisms I've made of them, of that thinking in that way, is the way it then has a tendency for them to kind of stop thinking about their immediate situation, right? You just say, oh well, I've got depression, and usually that meant
Right.
you've got some physiological problem, some imbalance, some misfiring, miswiring, whatever the latest theory is. Um, and then you stop kind of paying attention to the immediate circumstances you're in, the kind of pressure you're under, for instance, or
Mm.
right, or you lose touch with your emotions. So those all seem to me kind of um, problems that are kind of related in a way to that kind of categorizing uh,
Yeah.
of people, and not. I think I argue that we need to understand, not explain people. Um,
Mm.
we would the categories are meant to be some kind of explanation, but I think
Right.
it's better
They're
to
meant to
understand.
define. They're meant to label people and kind of identify and for some people it that's what it ultimately becomes. It becomes an identity. I am depressed. I am anxious. I am bipolar. Right. Whatever it may
Yeah,
be.
right,
I am ADHD. And that's just so limiting, right? It really, like you're saying, it really just limits the full human experience, the full personhood of who that individual is.
right, right, right.
Mm.
You see clients,
I do.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Do you diagnose them?
I do. I don't diagnose everyone. This is actually really. I'm glad you brought that up. This has really been an interesting transition for me as I just recently transitioned from northern Colorado. I'm based out of Colorado, and just recently transitioned from a private practice up there where we accepted insurance, and insurance requires let me clarify, most insurances require uh, a diagnosis within that first initial consultation, that first intake appointment.
Okay.
Most if not all. And whereas if you go into where I'm currently at, which is a private practice as well, but it's just private pay insurance, which comes with its own pros and cons, right? But because we're not accepting insurance, we're not confined to, we have to provide a diagnosis, right? And so I remember, just not even too long ago when I was working at this other private practice, I um, always felt pretty uncomfortable at times because I had to provide this diagnosis in order for insurance to reimburse my clients for their sessions. And there were times where it's like, okay, I'm just gonna give them the most accurate I can, even if I don't think it's truly fitting. And other times it was, even with where I'm currently at, I have given a few diagnoses. And it really does bring up the question of why, right? Why? What's the importance of the diagnosis? Um, and, for me, it's a lot about relating it to treatment planning, right? If we can give a general idea of what's going on with their experience, then we can provide a better treatment plan of how we're going to be able to best support them. But sometimes that's just not needed. You can still have a treatment plan. You can still support this individual the best you can,
Mhm.
even if they don't have a diagnosis.
Right, right. And I ask in part not again because I'm necessarily against that practice.
Hmm.
I can see you need a billing code
Right.
and so on, but the way in which it does seem like people. Now I'm thinking not so much of the therapist who may then give it for the purpose of billing and then otherwise make little reference to it, but the way in which people themselves seem to kind of hold on to those categories in ways that, again, it's understandable. But at the same time, again, how it kind of then limits what you can see, what you can think
Mm.
about your experience. the way other people then might change the way they relate to you, um, because now, one of the things I noticed in the interviews I did for the Chemically Imbalanced book was the way in which people would talk like about their friends or their family and how they sort of supported them initially, right, to initiate help seeking, to go to a doctor. But then it seemed
Mm,
like once they went to the doctor, and often they would get like a drug, um,
right.
that then family and friends just like disappear from the story, right?
Mm,
They're like sympathetic or something like that, but they seem no longer in a position to help, right? That they no longer talk about their problems with those people. Now I've got my diagnosis. I'm depressed, and that again had a whole set of meanings attached to it,
right.
that seemed to exclude, from my point of view, it would seem to me the very people who might be,
Mm.
really positioned to really help somebody, right? That
Oh, you're 100%
maybe
right. I
not
mean,
necessarily a doctor or just give me, if I can give one more example.
yeah,
I've
please.
studied drug ads, which are really
Mm,
fascinating things. Um, and I wrote one, it was one of those Psych Today columns
right.
in the blog about comparing ads from the 1960s with current ads for psychotropic drugs. Of course, the one in the 60s were in medical journals because they didn't have
Mm-hmm.
direct-to-consumer advertising, and now the ads now I was looking at were consumer ads in popular publications or on TV, and the way in which in the 60s people are always pictured in a context, right? Often,
Mm-hmm.
say they're, if especially like a man or a woman, the men were always pictured in some kind of work context, and the women were almost always portrayed in some kind of domestic context, right?
Right.
And they're whatever it was they were experiencing, whether it was Ritalin ads for low energy before they were giving it to kids, they would, and so you'd see some businessman who's clearly not succeeding because he doesn't have enough, sort of get up and go. And Ritalin is a good stimulant for that. And or you see a
Mm-hmm.
mother in some domestic thing, kind of overwhelmed by these domestic responsibilities and kind of trapped, if you will. And so they need some Valium, or the tranquilizer to help them in that context. And then the current context, though, there's never any context, right? The person is an isolated figure.
Mm.
And what I wrote about was an ad for the drug antidepressant Prestique, and it's a wind-up doll. And in the before picture, you know how the ads work before and after. In the before picture, it's like a wind-up doll whose spring has wound down, right?
Mm.
And it's in
So
this
it's
kind
not
of dead
moving.
pose. It's like a woman; her arms are stiff. She's slightly
Mm.
bent, like a toy, right? And there's a big wind-up thing on the back of it, right? But there's no family around her, nothing. She's just this isolated figure. And of course, the implication is supposed to be that she has some chemical problem in her brain.
Right.
So there's no context of any kind. There's never nothing. She actually looks a little like a hospital patient or something.
Mm.
And then you see the after picture. She's rejoined her family, right? But what I found interesting is the family is not with her in her sadness or her
In the
despair or whatever
before.
she's experiencing. They're somehow waiting for her at some safe distance,
Mm.
frankly, because in some of them they almost look a little afraid of her. In the women's ones, and so on. And again, it had that same kind of feeling like the people that are close to you are not going to be of any help to you, right? Once you kind of have an official mental disorder or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it
Until
just
you
seems to
have a
me,
diagnosis, until you have yourself medicated and can have some degree of control over your symptoms, your family's not going to be able to support you or be a part of
yeah,
your
yeah,
life.
right, right. And that seems to
Mm.
me like really wrong. I
Oh,
would think
yeah.
that's exactly who can. I mean, assuming you have a family and have people that love
Right.
you, obviously not everyone has that, but
Mm.
if you do, it would seem to be cutting those people off,
Yeah.
rendering them kind of irrelevant. Seems to be a
Mm.
serious problem if you want, in terms of just helping people flourish.
Right. Right. It does make me wonder though, like how much of that is true in people's lives. I think of going back to the article you wrote around ADHD, and I thought it was super interesting, just your thoughts about how, specifically with ADHD, when we, prescribe medications, provider, not we meaning me, but, when providers and doctors are prescribing medication for ADHD, it's less about it can be less about actually helping the kid and managing their symptoms and more about, I think, I don't remember the exact words used, but like creating like a docile, um, individual, a docile kid who is more manageable for everybody else in his life.
Right, right,
Mm.
right. And and there's a history around ADHD and thinking about it. Of course, ADHD itself dates only to 1980. So
Right.
there were prior categories, right? Mainly around being hyperkinetic or overactive, and that was the
Hmm.
central, and that went by different names and so on. And but again, drug ads from the '60s around kids, the problem child, and so on, were really about controlling children, and it in somewhat explicitly in those terms. While the meaning of ADHD has continued to morph and change, in the executive functions version of it, attention's no longer even a central concern. Not only
Yeah.
is activity left behind, but attention is left behind
Right.
too. And now you move to something like you're not an optimizing person. You're not the sort of person who's making kind of long-term plans and is systematically moving through the world to achieve your goals. Okay. Now, I still think that's an unusual kid who does that, actually does that. It's not clear to me when Russell Barkley or somebody defines normal, how
Hmm.
many kids are actually in that category, because I
Right.
can't imagine it's that large. Uh,
Hmm.
I mean, how many kids at 12 years old, have a life plan, right? That they're somehow denying themselves and sort of systematically. But so ADHD has come to mean a lot like that. Uh, uh, but it's still about control, right? It's still about kids that aren't prioritizing school in the way somebody else wants them to, right? Now being put on a medication, right, to kind of focus them and press them forward,
Hmm.
to do that. Um, and again, it, and maybe one other point, I guess, is just it seems like, we keep changing things in our society to benefit the strong, right? Again, my own kids, I have three children. They're adopted. Each two of the three have some kind of handicapped, and the third one, not exactly, but kind of. um,
Yeah.
and maybe his are more like common young
Hmm.
adult problems, than not necessarily. But anyway, the point is just that, right, the ability to kind of navigate this world as it gets just more and more complicated, and just the sheer paperwork, um,
Hmm.
the ability to manipulate screens and do all these things, and manage money that's not like real money. It's ones and zeros on a computer and so on. It just gets harder and harder, and it strikes me as more and more people can't manage it, right? And I do think those are a lot that we end up diagnosing. They don't have there's nothing unusual about them, right?
Hmm.
They're just not the type A sorts. I mean, if you read Russell Barkley, maybe you know that name. He's a very
I saw
well-known
him when in your articles. Yeah.
ADHD guy, yeah, and he's the executive function theory and all that.
Yeah.
And
You keep
his
mentioning that the executive function theory. Would you mind explaining just briefly what that is for my audience?
well, this is I think Barkley is one of the originators of this idea, um, and the idea is that what he sees as the common denominator of kids who are being diagnosed with ADHD, is not that they have an attention kind of pathology. I think
A
it's wide.
deficit.
I think almost everybody now recognizes that that even a kid with ADHD can pay attention to what they're motivated to pay attention to.
Hmm.
Like they can play
Yeah.
video games all day and stuff like that, right?
Hmm.
So then the question is, well, what is their problem? And his argument is around kind of being impulsive, not being able to have a goal and then kind of and executive functions are supposed to be controlled by the frontal lobes of the brain,
Right. The prefrontal
which are around
cortex.
the dopamine
Hmm.
receptors. Again, a lot of the definitions of ADHD have largely been kind of drug induced, if you will. So you work
Yeah.
backward from the interpretation of the drug to what the problem
Mm.
is, right? So you haven't, what the drug is doing is addressing
Right.
executive functions
Because
in the
most of the
brain.
drugs are focused on increasing the dopamine levels.
Yeah, and
Right.
how does that help? Well,
Mm.
in this theory, it helps because what it makes you is a more self-optimizing person, someone who can delay gratification, right? Who can set a goal, who can be focused on the right things versus the wrong things, the
Right.
right things, and then right. And so they sort of successfully, right, which is exactly kind of our picture of the autonomous young person is somebody who can plan, they can build their resume to get into the good college, and sort of do all these things, and so those who are normal, if you will, or neurotypical, apparently do all those things.
Mm.
And anybody who can't or doesn't want to or is unmotivated to do those things, those then are the ones who get labeled. 1 in 5 high school age boys have an ADHD diagnosis.
Wow.
And they're exploding the use
Yeah.
of ADHD, the diagnosis of, I don't talk about these in articles because they're focused on kids, but
Hmm.
the fastest growing use of a drug is Adderall by 20 something, especially women.
Mm.
Um, and my hunch is they're having the same problem that high school age boys are, which is that
Hmm.
now you're out in the work world, you're looking at spreadsheets in your cubicle all day, and you're like, what the hell, right? Why am I doing this? What's
Yeah.
this got to do with me? I mean, imagine that 12-year-old boy or one of my kids in school, I'm like, why am I here? What's this got to do with me? Why am I doing this? etc. My hunch is
Mm.
that now affects adults as well who are out in
Yeah.
the place. Anyway,
How
I
much?
probably have gotten away from your question somehow, but
No, no, this is really interesting. It kind of brings up this question of like how much is actually quote unquote wrong with you, or is wrong in your brain, or wrong in your body, and how much of it is actually just maybe your environment. How much of it is the fact that you're sitting in an office all day, like you just said, at a cubicle looking at a computer screen all day, and that's not going to help anybody's attention. Nobody can stay attentive to
well,
that
right,
for
exactly.
10
Well,
hours a
some
day.
can. That's just it. You keep narrowing who can. Right?
Mm.
Some people can sit at a computer all day,
Yeah, that's fair.
right?
Yeah.
Again, think of things on a bell curve, right?
Mm.
Well, there's always somebody who can do certain things, and it feels to me like our society, the way it's going, is that just more and more people are on the two ends of the curve and are,
Yeah.
that normal is getting shrinking, right? That to be normal is some
Mm.
child who can think about school and their future and how they have to get a college degree. I have an
Right.
article from the New York Times here that asks about is your first grader college ready? Right? And it was
Wow.
about some school district that would take kids, first graders, to local colleges, right? And the kids are all like wearing, it was in North Carolina, so some had like Duke, t-shirts on, or North Carolina t-shirts on, and so on. Or they're already like thinking about this and so on, etc. And it was like, wow, what the hell? I mean, um, so those expectations, when you ratchet up those expectations that you should be able to do that and so on, it seems to me
Mm.
just more and more people can't do it. Not because they're anything wrong with them. They're just different sorts of human beings, right?
Yeah.
Human beings come in all kinds of flavors and sizes and bell curves, right?
Mm.
Right, from all the way from extremely shy, extremely outgoing, right? There isn't one personality type. There's a whole
Right.
spectrum of personality types, and if you begin to kind of pathologize, not
Mm.
directly but indirectly, right? You make everything so that you have to be outgoing, for instance, you put everybody into a situation in which they have to be outgoing, then you're gonna pathologize some people, right? Because they
Mm,
just that's not who they are. And I had
right.
all kinds of people I interviewed who thought they had social anxiety disorder, right?
Mm,
Why? Simply because they're not as outgoing as the people around them. And that, and rather than see that as just, well, that's one, we have different personalities.
yeah.
Humans come in different types, right?
Mm,
This would be a kind of self-pathologizing. They
yeah.
go to the doctor and say, I need a drug. I've got a disorder. And again, that kind of language seems to me to
Mm,
miss the environment, miss like,
right.
well, what is it? Why do you think that in the first place?
Right. Miss
Right?
all the other factors that play a role in into that line of thinking.
Yeah, yeah, and
Mm,
maybe it's okay to be what you're like. Maybe
yeah.
why not that?
Mm,
And again, it may be, again, we have this kind of ideology of everybody should be able to do everything, right? So yes, you're right. If you have a lot of stage fright, then I wouldn't go into work that requires you to be on stage all the time.
sure.
That used to be a perfectly fine thing to say. Now people want to think, oh well, gee, you're
Mm,
limiting somebody's potential or something like that. And it was like, yeah, well, but really, I interviewed a young woman in my book, the Chemical Imbalance book, who's on a drug. She decided she wants to be a college teacher, right? But she's like terrified of standing up in front of people. So she hopes she can do it on a drug, right?
mm,
It doesn't come natural to her, so she hopes she can simulate an outgoing personality with the drug, right?
yeah.
And
What do you think that
it's
says
not going to
maybe?
work. I didn't tell her that in the interview, but I just thought, it's really not going
Yeah.
to work. You can't really, they're trying to simulate this stuff with drugs. Just,
Mm,
it doesn't really work. And the people I've interviewed who are on drugs, who hoped for those kind of things, if they'd been on the drug long enough, had come to kind of, it wasn't that they didn't like the drug, say, or want to go off it or necessarily, but they did really ratchet down their expectations, right?
mm,
That even on the drug, you're still kind of sad. You're not, it doesn't really change your personality in the way that you might have hoped. And
right.
so those hopes tend to be kind of dashed,
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
rather than
that
just
is
kind of,
interesting though. Like, thinking of that one example of the lady who wanted to be a teacher but couldn't really do it without being on medication. Like, what what do you think that speaks to? Was that just like a personal dream of hers? Like this is something that she wanted to do and like had hopes and dreams and like this is it for me? Or was it more of like, and it's hard because we can't, again, there's just so many factors that probably went into this, but
yeah, yeah,
is it more of something that was like a societal pressure of like, well, all my friends are going into education and that's what I want to do, or what were you kind of noticing when you were
yeah,
interviewing
yeah.
this lady?
Well, she had, uh, well, so she'd been shy all her life,
Hmm.
and 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 she had initially, I think, kind of agreed with that. Her parents thought that. Her teachers at school used to say that, she's kind of withdrawn and she should be more outgoing in class or doesn't raise her hand enough, and that kind of stuff. Stuff
Right.
shy people are used to hearing, frankly. Uh, and then in like college, again, you begin to kind of feel somewhat uh, dis- yeah, at a disadvantage that you're not outgoing, especially you go to big parties and stuff like that. Again, most of the kids I know that shy just don't do that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But right, if you did, right, and 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 then um, and then I think she just stayed in school long enough, and then she went to like graduate school that she was like, I mean, that's what if you go for a PhD, it's to teach. I mean, that was sort of
Mm, right.
it felt to me like she had just stayed in school, um, and then decided like, okay, now this is what the environment's about, right? This is what people
Mm-hmm.
do who get these kind of
Oh,
degrees,
gotcha.
and so then, okay, I need to do this. So she, and then really quite intentionally says, I think I need some help here,
Hmm.
um, and she goes gets gets a diagnosis, which it seems to be quite easy. And, I don't, you're talking to people, you're not talking to the doctor they saw, so you don't never quite sure
Right.
what they're telling you, how much of it's, but the way they tell it, say, is that it's very easy to go in and tell the doctor, look,
It
here's
can
my
be.
struggles.
Yeah.
Doctor says, yeah, I can see that's a problem. Try this, start some on a medication
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And then she noticed an immediate change. She was suddenly talking up in class, and even though she's, the funny part was she says things like, she'll blurt stuff out, kind of thoughtlessly on the
Hmm.
drug, right? So the drug does have an impact on you, right?
Right.
And but she didn't really see that as a problem because she thought, well, at least
Hmm.
I'm active now,
Being vocal.
and so on. And again, I think it gave her a kind of hope that she could, in effect, have a different personality,
Mm-hmm.
right? That that the one she had actually wasn't her real personality. Her real personality, which everyone has on this view, the neurotypical, all have an outgoing personality. So if you're shy, it's because something, usually neurochemical, is preventing you from having the normal neurotypical
Hmm.
experience, which is outgoing, right? And again, this is one of the ways in which especially the psychiatric talk, they map social norms onto the brain,
Yeah.
right? So that for Russell Barkley, a normal kid, right, a normal 13-year-old can plan a future and then begin to pursue those goals in a systematic way. And that kid will delay gratification, who will make school their priority, who will recognize, right, what matters in this world and what doesn't. They'll be exceedingly congenial and easy to get along with. They'll never rock the boat, right?
Hmm.
Again, and I get these ideas not because he ever says anything like that, but because it's the flip side of what's pathologized, right? And so it seems to me like, and once you put that on the brain, then if you're any other way, your problem is you have a brain problem, right?
Hmm.
Not just that you're a different kind of person or that the environment is requiring something of you, that you can't really deliver.
Right.
It's just not in your
Yeah.
your capacities.
Yeah. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of room for individuality and differences in our culture. It seems very bilinear. It's either this or it's that. You fit into this and this is good, or you don't, and that means that must be bad.
Yeah, yeah,
And that just seems like a broken system.
yeah. And it's
Hmm.
ironic because we think of ourselves not as rigid
Mm-hmm.
and you know narrow, but as tolerant and let everything hang out. I mean, we as a society seem to imagine
Mm.
ourselves as being really easygoing and big on difference. But then
Right.
in the actual experience, it seems to me, is that it just moves toward a kind of homogenizing, right?
Hmm.
It's okay as long as you're all kind of the same person, as long as you all get along in the same way,
Right.
or you're emotionally intelligent, and think of all those things. They just require an incredible amount from people. And again, a
Hmm.
lot of people, some percentage of people can do that, right? They can
Right.
be right, but there's just some people that can't, and
Hmm.
um, they can't, right? It's just they're not on the whatever
Yeah.
that thing is, and
And
all of
that's
us in different
okay.
ways fail on different of these aspects, right?
Hmm.
I've never met anyone, right, who can do it all, right?
Right.
Everybody's unhappy about something, right? Some aspect of their life where they feel inadequate, that they're not able to kind of meet the norms because the norms are so hard to meet, right? And uh, yeah, this is about our environment. It's about a world we live in that seems to me is we need to resist, and that's why it's good that we can actually.
Right. Yeah.
I do think
And
we can.
yeah, kind of like what you're mentioning earlier, and then also in your articles, there does seem to be almost like a draw to some of the things we've been talking about, things like diagnoses, things like medications. I see this with my own. Sounds like you've seen this in your research, where, especially, I see this a lot with adolescents who are in and they're like, "Oh, I think I have." Uh, gosh, something that's been really big is I think I have dissociative identity disorder. And it's these kids coming in and I'm like, okay, well, let's let's talk about that. Like, what's making you think that? And talk about it. And ultimately it boils down to, well, I saw this on social media, I saw this on a TV show.
Yeah, yeah,
I was talking to friends about it, my friends who are also DID and have alters and all these different things. And it's like there seems to be this draw, and it's not always that extreme, right? Where it is a very extreme illness, if that's the case, or condition. Um, but sometimes it's more quote unquote mild things like ADHD or depression or anxiety,
yeah.
and it for me it brings up this question of like, why do you want this, right? Like, what is the draw to being diagnosed with this, to getting on medication? Is it like a security issue of, I'm struggling right now. I feel the weight of my experiences, whatever those might be, and to be able to have a name for it, to be able to take something that is supposed to take that away, does that provide like a sense of security? Uh,
Mhm.
what I'm curious, like, what have you found in your research? What are you noticing on that side of things as far
Yeah,
as
yeah.
this experience goes?
Well, and what can I ask? It sounds is security the thing that you see? Does that seem to be
That's kind
what
of what I'm
need is the
hypothesizing. Yeah, that's what I'm wondering is it's a way of naming this unknown, right? There's these things that are going on. I'm feeling depressed, whatever that may mean. What's really interesting to me is the more what we call, the more extreme mental health conditions. Like dissociative identity disorder is very it is very rare, and it's usually a result of a lot of trauma,
right,
and a lot of not being able to deal with that trauma very well. So there's things like that. There's things like bipolar, schizophrenia. I remember in particular, I had one client who came in, and almost every week it was something different. I think I'm DID. I think, and then I'll have to talk to them, be like, but you're not, you're not,
mm,
and
mm,
why do you want to be, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And just seeing like the crestfallen, face of like, oh God, like, but I thought I was, right? And then coming in next week, it's like, okay, you're right. I don't think I am, but I think I'm this instead. And yeah, I think it's this almost for some, again, not for all, but for some, I wonder if it is a matter of feeling secure, of being able to name and put a label to their experiences that maybe before they're not able to label. It's just so big of an unknown, and the scary part is there just may not be a word to describe all of their experiences that feel overwhelming. um,
yeah. That's right.
but it is interesting because I see it a lot,
Yeah,
especially with adolescents, which is who I mostly work with nowadays.
right, right. Yeah, and I've had a number of, like in my Prozac culture, students have talked about how they're constantly, I'll claim, ideas about stigma and so, and then they'll say, well, yeah, but, on our TikTok and so on, people are talking like nonstop about
Yeah.
being depressed or being anxious or, et
Hmm.
cetera. And they seem not worried about stigma at all. They seem to, kind of hold it out like some kind of, and just easily talk about it and so on without seemingly much concern. Um,
Right.
I would, I think, I have two thoughts about that. Um, One, I do think you're right about. Um, I think because in this environment, we're all feeling like we fail in different areas,
Mm.
right? It's like, why are we failing? Um, right? We live in a world where we're seemingly free to choose everything, right? And then it's like, if
Right.
I'm free to choose everything, how is it I could be unhappy,
Hmm.
right? There seems there's some paradox there, right? Um, and uh, so I think on the one hand, because everything seems to come back to us, right? Then when things go wrong, these these diagnoses provide a certain kind of account for what's going wrong, right? They
Hmm.
explain.
Yeah.
I was talking with my physician one time at my annual physical, and he knows what I write about and so on. So we started talking about he was telling me about how all the parents come in.
Hmm.
He's had a lot of parents come in and who took their kids Adderall and then
Oh,
thought,
who like tried it?
yeah, who tried it, and then they were like, wow, right? I must have ADHD too, right?
Oh,
Because
because
oh,
they're
I could
feeling
get
so
so much
good
so
on it.
done, and etc. And or they've I always had problems, focusing on this or that or concentrating when all the interesting parts of a job are over. Then I get kind of bored by it or whatever. And
Hmm.
man, with this, I could just power through on the Adderall. And then he's in this position where he's trying to convince them, as I gather you've been, where he's trying
Right.
to convince them, no, no, you don't have ADHD, right?
Hmm.
And these are successful people, by the way, or not,
Sure.
etc. But I think certain kinds of, and certainly I've had people say to me in interviews, right, that it provides an explanation. And in
Hmm.
fact, one of the drug ads for Strattera, which is a non-stimulant drug
Yeah.
used sometimes for ADHD, they have one of their ads from years ago that I used as a title of a recent article was the explanation you've been looking for.
Hmm.
All right, and I thought that says a lot, right? Is you've been looking for an explanation. Look, why is it I fail on this? Why is it I'm not as good as I think I should be? Why am I not as outgoing, right, as I think I should be? Why am I not living up to my potential, whatever that
Hmm.
means? And so I do think they often provide explanations for people. The other point that I wanted to make was that um, it gets back to this idea that we're the choosers,
Hmm.
right? Is
Yeah.
that everything kind of, the old drug ads I was mentioning back in the 60s, at least they could point to role conflicts, right? Right. Say the
Hmm.
working woman who also does the second shift and has to deal with kids and so on. So you can see stress in that environment, and then you just connect and just say, well, maybe this drug can help you deal with that stress, right? And so, but when you think about now, right, in which everything is a choice, what roles you take, whether you're a parent or not, these are all your own choices, or at least we presented to us in that way.
Right.
Then it's like, well, what's going wrong, right? Our social environment becomes kind of invisible to us, right? Or we imagine that to be normal is to be outgoing or being type A and able to, like some little accountant who can just keep track of everything, and and or little homo economicus, who's just rationally calculating their future, can do all this sort of stuff and with the greatest of ease, and and so then when something goes wrong, right, you're left like with no explanation, like, well,
Hmm.
what you know you, it's hard to, curiously enough, even the students I've met who are keenly aware of all the stresses in their environment, but somehow they never connected their own problems to those stresses,
Hmm.
right? It was always something's wrong with me, right? And if something's wrong with you, then, and it's not the stresses, then what is it, right? And that's again where these explanations, especially the biological ones, seem to fill a need that it was like, oh, well, maybe my chemicals are just off.
Hmm.
There's
Yeah.
no evidence for that, by the way. But,
Right.
I mean, these
Well, it is
biological
interesting. Like
theories
you.
don't really have any grounding.
Yeah.
They're I mean, we all think surely there must be some biological component,
Hmm. But
especially
that's not always
very
true. I
small
mean,
disorders. But it's not like we
yeah.
can actually show one,
Right.
right?
I mean,
The
something
number
that
of
came up to
papers written
me.
on this is in the tens of thousands, and you know, it's not like you can show one. It's not like you can show a neurobiological issue with ADHD.
Right.
And even what if you could, it always strikes me as like, well, maybe we're just showing the genetics of different parts of the bell curve,
Hmm.
right? I mean, presumably all our actions and personalities, or different features of us, have some genetic signature somehow, right? Not
Right.
that we know what it is, but presumably, because humans are different, they must be biologically different too. So it
Hmm.
isn't clear to me that even if you could show some difference, whether you're actually showing an abnormality or just another kind of human being, because there are no lesions, and everybody recognizes mental illness is not associated with a lesion, and I mean
Hmm.
that is some actual, you know, uh, injury to the brain. right?
Right.
So it's not injuries. So if there's no injuries, then again, what would the biology actually tell us? Would it tell us that
Right.
there's something wrong, or would it just tell us that humans come in different
Right.
shapes and forms? Something we already knew. So anyway, um, sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of, when I was reading your articles and kind of doing my own research beforehand, it made me think of the fact that there's research out there to support that medication, when it comes to depression, for example, medication alone is not more effective than either psychotherapy or psychotherapy in conjunction with medication. Those are shown to be more effective than just medication alone, which I
Right,
find really interesting. And yet, how many people out there are on medication and yet aren't doing counseling, aren't in relationship with other people, uh, aren't doing for treatment outside of medication.
right, right. Well, and
Yeah.
there's a kind of you can see where there's a certain logic, and people I interviewed often draw on this logic. If I have a chemical problem, if that's really what the problem is,
Right.
right? Then the drug is the thing. What does
Mm-hmm.
that talking have to do with a neurochemical problem?
Right.
So there was a kind of logic to thinking that, right, if I've got a brain disorder, then what I need to do is address the brain. And the analogy, of course, is commonly with diabetes, right?
Mm.
It's like, well, for diabetes, you don't go in and talk to somebody,
Right.
though you might in terms of your diet or things like that, but rather
Sure.
that you take the insulin. And so these kinds of analogies are really common
Mm.
in psychiatry, and people use them and so on. And
Yeah.
and
But
I think
maybe
that
that's part of the issue. Maybe we need to change the conversation around things like diabetes. Like, maybe you should be going to talk to somebody if you're struggling with diabetes, right?
well, and maybe you are. I just use the
Yeah.
type 2 diabetes, of course, in fact, has
Right.
to do a lot with your diet and things like that. But the analogy was that if you have a biological problem, you deal with it biologically.
No, yeah, I
And
hear what you're
and I
saying.
think
Yeah.
that's that. In my book, Chemically Imbalanced, I'm not against drugs.
Hmm.
What I'm really against is these kind of biological explanations.
Yeah.
Because
There needs
drugs,
to.
I think drugs, my again, just as an amateur reading the literature, is that if you do use a drug, use it for a short term,
Mm,
for acute situations, right? If you're crying
yeah.
all day and a drug can help you stop, or you can't sleep and the drug can help you sleep, okay, that seems like a practical use of a medication. Um, but then the question is, what's really going on with you, right?
Mm,
What's the problem, right? And the
yeah.
problem, um, and that's going to be a question. That's going to be something you dialogue with. It's something you
Mm,
interpret. What's going on in my experience? Why
yeah.
those why questions have to be asked. And I feel like with you get on medication, you stop asking the why questions because you think
Mm,
you have an answer. Oh, it's just
right.
biology, right? And but the why questions, it seems to me, are really crucial if what you want to do is actually get better. You want to change the
Oh,
situation, or
but why don't we just kind of end? What are some last words of wisdom, if you could pass on to my audience, just from what you've learned and just from what we've been talking about today?
well, um, uh, I think that I think maybe the main thing. I guess if I had to say one thing, it would be something like um, helping people build more friendships and social networks that they can rely upon, and not and actual ones, right? Not online networks and so on. It seems to me like a lot of our struggles come back to the fact that we're in some sense disconnected from one another, and not, kind of in a certain kind of genuine relationships. Even the college, especially the girls, will often talk about their friends in that kind of frenemy way, that they can't really talk about their experience for fear of appearing not to be perfect or appearing not to have it all together, and so the kind of cultivating of close relationships with friends that can help be a certain kind of protection from the kind of pressures and stuff that kids are living under and experiencing, and that, again, that kind of rampant sense of inadequacy. It seems to me that, in part can help if you have at least people around who don't think you're inadequate, who can help you, kind of see what your value and how you're worthwhile and you're not a loser and all the kind of messages that kids get.
Right.
So I guess that would be it, and both family, friendships, um, uh, and so on, and professional help if it's needed. But it seems like a lot of these things don't have to get to a professional if they could just be addressed within one's relational network. And I say to people, it's like, well, I've never been to a psychologist in my life, and I don't anticipate being, not because I don't have any problems, but because I have friends.
Right.
And when things get hard, right, that's who I talk to. Not just my spouse, but also other male friends, and so on, who get together and who, you know, you can kind of cultivate a relationship that's close and that you can talk about, stuff that's going wrong, or work, things, problems and stuff like that. That's
Mm.
anyway. That you know, I'm a sociologist, so there's a sociological answer: is
No, that's perfect. Yeah.
join a community.
No, that's great. Well, hey, thank you so much, Dr. Davis. I really appreciate your time. And